to. So what does management do with regards to risk management? Remember, we spoke about governance earlier, but now we're talking about management, not just the board now, but senior management, IT risk managers, technology and cyber risk managers. What do we actually do? So we foresee challenges that could affect our business objectives. And then we mitigate these by preparing policies, guidelines, and procedure manuals, implementing standards, seeking to reduce to lower the likelihood of a challenge or a risk materializing, or we also seek to lower the impact of the risk if it were to materialize. We maximize opportunities if the challenge were to present a potential business gain. So what have I said there? We need to ensure that in everything we're doing, we're seeking to support the business's objectives, the corporate objectives stated in the company's 3-year or 5-year or 1-year strategic plan. And if we don't know what's in the strategic plan, of course, we can't foresee risks to those plans. So it's always a good idea, and I mentioned this later, it's always a good idea to have an understanding, to read your company's plans. What does the company intend to achieve over the next year? What does your company intend to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years? Because everything that IT, InfoSec does needs to align first and foremost with the business's objectives. If the business is saying, for example, that it would like to open an office in Asia in the next year in its business plan, as an IT and InfoSec risk professional, it's your responsibility to start trying to identify risks. That may materialize as a result of opening up an office in Asia. Not so that you can say to the business, no, you can't open an office in Asia, but so that you can support the business in its plans to actually open the office. As information security professionals, we are not there to block business plans or to block our employees or colleagues' ability to do their job. That is not our responsibility. It's our responsibility to seek to find ways for our businesses or our colleagues to safely perform their objectives or their jobs. So we foresee those challenges, and then we prepare policies, guidelines, procedure manuals. We implement any standards that may apply, and we'll talk about those in a moment, to reduce the risk to the business as a result of those plans or objectives. We seek to lower the impact if the risk were to materialize. And we also seek to empower our businesses to maximize any opportunities if there are any opportunities to be gained by opening that office in Asia. So we're not there as blockers. Risk managers, information security managers, IT managers are not blockers to business productivity. And whenever a business presents its plans to us, we should not be seeking to say no. We should be seeking to identify means of helping the business to realize that goal. Policies, standards, guidelines, and procedures, what are they? A policy is what the board, senior management team have established. So it's the tone at the top. This is the direction we intend to travel in. And this is what you must do as an employee. Acceptable use policy, for example. Many of us may have signed up to an acceptable use policy in our employment contract, saying that we agree to conform to using the IT systems for the manner or in the manner that it was intended. That we won't use the corporate IT systems for personal work. We won't send offensive material through our corporate IT systems. That is a policy. What the board senior management team are mandating should be done within the firm. Then we have standards. PCI DSS, that applies to firms that process credit card data. We've got the ISO 27000 and X series. So we'll talk about a few of those with regards to risk management shortly. Guidelines are best practice and they're not mandatory. And then we've got procedures, user guides. But the most important two of these are policy, company policy, corporate policy, and then the standards. What is the IT risk professional's responsibility? Or what responsibilities can you expect to be charged with in your role as an IT risk professional? Well, you'd be required to collect and review information for you to be able to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities. You need to do a lot of reading yourself on external threats. We're responsible for identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities, which we can't do without research, without reading, without listening out on the news, without joining forums on LinkedIn, information security, information risk forums on LinkedIn. We may be required to develop a set of IT risk scenarios. That is, this could happen. We could experience a ransomware attack. We'd be required to identify key accountable stakeholders. That is, who will own this particular risk, who will be responsible for signing off to say they've accepted this risk if a decision has been made to accept a risk. We could be required to establish an IT risk register if one doesn't exist already in the company, and to identify the risk appetite. What is the risk appetite and who sets the risk appetite? The risk appetite is set by the board. This is how much risk we can accept to do business. This is how much risk we're prepared to accept to continue doing business. Remember, we said at the start that there is inherent risk within every single business. There's inherent risk in living. The fact that one is alive means that there are risks that we face on a daily basis. Any company in operations will face risks on a daily basis. So we need to identify the risk appetite that has been set by the board or the senior management team, and the tolerance defined by senior management team and key stakeholders. What is tolerance? When a board sets the risk appetite, they then delegate the responsibility, not accountability, the responsibility for managing those risks to managers, heads of departments, for example. So the IT director, CISO, CIO, they will have a tolerance. And let's give a brief example. If the company has said that our risk appetite means that we can tolerate losses up to 50 million per year, that would have to be a very large, very big business. We can tolerate losses of up to 50 million per year. They could then say that for each chief officer, C-level officer, chief information officer, CISO, chief financial officer, that the tolerance is set at $1 million or pounds or whatever per year. And that means that if a C-suite leader is facing a risk, has identified a risk that could potentially cost more than $1 million, they need to escalate that risk to the board. Whereas if the risk is less than $1 million, then the C-suite or head of department or whoever that person is has the authority to deal with that risk on behalf of the board. The boards don't want to see every single risk that may exist within the business unit. And that C-level officer may then set a tolerance for the different managers or the different team leaders in their department, that if you have a risk that will cost less than 10K, you can deal with that. I delegate you with the authority to deal with that risk. But if the risk may cause a potential loss of above 10K, then you need to escalate that to me. So the idea behind tolerance levels is to delegate authority to the next level downwards, so that the senior manager, the board, they're not dealing with risks of low value on a daily basis, rather than dealing with the strategic priorities of the business. So the IT risk professional is responsible for identifying the corporate risk appetite and then any tolerance that has been delegated to them, to you and I. I could work in a firm where they say to me that, okay, any risk that may cost the business less than 5K, you have the authority to resolve that risk, to remediate that risk without asking us for permission. So we identify that risk appetite and tolerance, and we work within the tolerance set by the next level above us. And we also collaborate in the development of a risk or of risk awareness sessions, Responding to two questions here: how big is a usual team for a small, medium, or large company? It really depends. I've worked in companies where I was the CIO and head of information security, and we had a very small team, simply because We were a charitable organization. Well, on the other hand, you could have a small organization where their business is to develop apps. If the organization is, say, 100 employees strong, because their risks are so high, they may place a premium on having a large number of staff dedicated to risk management. So it depends on the business and what the business does. I hope I answered your question there. And Daniel, you've asked, how do you get to quantify or place a value on the risk? We're going to actually do that, hopefully by this afternoon. But later this afternoon, we'll do that. So who defines the criteria parameters for quantifying this risk in terms of the dollar value? A very good question again. What tends to happen in most firms is that they prefer to do the qualitative risk assessment. Most firms actually just do qualitative risk assessment where they go through red, amber, green, and we'll talk about that later. So let me not just get too heavy into that at the moment. So an IT risk professional may be required to develop risk awareness material, training material for employees, and then to deliver that training. What is the baseline knowledge that we need as IT risk professionals? The first thing we need to understand when we move to a company is the corporate mission. What is the mission? What is the business goal? Why is this company in business? What are they seeking to do? And I'd actually say, although I've written here that this is the internal IT risk professional baseline knowledge required, I'd say that before you join a company, try and understand their mission. Try and see what exactly their goals are. What is their business? What is their core business offering? By the time you start working in the company, it's more than vital that you actually understand that. Then you also need to understand the regulations that govern your industry, that company's industry, and regulations that may apply to that company as an individual organization. We talk about industry-specific regulations. If you work in the financial services sector, for example, or the rail sector or the manufacturing sector, there will be regulations that govern that sector, and you need to familiarize yourself with those regulations. Because as an IT risk professional, you're also responsible for compliance with any technology or security-specific regulations that may apply to your company. So you need to take that time. If you work in a bank, you need to understand the regulations that apply, operational resilience, for example, that mandate on the financial services sector. You need to understand all of that. If you work in a financial bank or somewhere like that, you need to also understand how the PCI DSS regulations apply to you, or SOX. So as risk professionals, it's not sufficient to simply understand risk. It's never sufficient to simply understand risk or to even understand IT and risk. It's vital that we understand any regulations that apply to our corporate industry and to our company specifically. You can always read up on a company. Have they been fined and placed under sanctions by a regulator? And if so, how do those sanctions affect IT risk? Let's say a company, for example, a bank has been caught trading with a company with a country that they're not required to trade with, for example. So they've now been banned by the regulator from trading in that financial instrument for 2 years or so. You need to understand that. You need to understand that. If a company's been banned from processing data for 6 months, let's say, because there's been an information security breach, or sorry, data protection breach, of course you need to know that. You need to understand any regulatory mandates on your company and that also apply to your industry. Then, of course, as I said earlier, you need to understand the SMT, the governance, the board, all of their risk appetite, the risk culture. Before you join a company, speak to people, check on Glassdoor. It's so important you identify that the company operates a culture of blame. Don't go there. And you need to have a knowledge of the technology that exists within the company once you join, because I know that there's often this debate about whether chief information security officers and chief information officers are required to have a knowledge of technology. And whilst many will claim, no, they're not required to have that knowledge of technology, they just need to have a knowledge of the business, I would say that it's helped me personally immensely to have started from a technology background. And this doesn't mean that you just go out there and obtain certification in all these technologies, but do read up on the technologies that you meet in any company that you join. Read up, make sure that you're clued up. Once you've joined the company, find out what systems, because if you don't know the systems, you can't really identify any risk to the systems. Other responsibilities: collect and review information, identify potential threats and vulnerabilities, and we will get to all of this. Develop a comprehensive set of relevant IT risk scenarios, identify key accountable stakeholders, establish an IT risk register, which we'll talk about again later. And we've talked about all of this, so this appears to be a duplicate. What considerations do we need to make? And I know that we don't like this word strategy, but let's just use that word in a very simple context. The IT risk professional needs to consider strategic risk, including political risk, economic risk, change risk, competitive risk, political risk. Well, if your company's operating in a company where there's the risk of political violence or political change, there's elections coming up, you need to understand how this might affect IT and the business objectives. Remember, well, I remember, dare I say, when Brexit started to become a reality. companies in the financial services sector had to do a lot of work to change their systems, to adapt their systems for the fact that the UK was no longer in the EU. So that was a political risk that would have gone on many companies' risk register from June the 24th or something in 2016, once we voted to leave the EU. That is a political risk, but it had many ramifications for IT systems. If you're in a country where, in an EU country where the euro has been adopted, and you're an IT risk person, a professional, and that country votes to leave the EU, there would be a lot of IT risk simply because a lot of systems would need to be reconfigured to reflect the fact that the euro is no longer the company's main currency. That's why we keep an ear out for political risk, economic risk. When we talk about economic risk, if the economy is going down, that means that there's less money available for IT to deliver, or IT risk to even deliver. It's a business, it's operations, because the company's finances would be affected, the company's revenue would be affected. Operational risk, and this is a key matter for risk professionals. A lot of jobs that are advertised will say, we're looking for an operational risk professional with technology risk skills. A lot of operational risk roles are advertised for IT or information security risk professionals. So we need to understand internal fraud, error, user error, internal fraud. Our systems, our employees or colleagues using our systems fraudulently. Error, accidentally making errors when posting information into our systems. Accidentally deleting information that should be retained. Then we've got credit risk, market risk, supply chain risk, that is a core one. Third party risk, supply chain risk, IT risk. These are things that we just need to be aware of, and we can't be aware of everything, but it does help to have an awareness of these different types of risks. So that when, rather than saying that I'm an IT risk professional, I can sell myself as a risk professional, a well-rounded risk professional. Competencies. So this is almost a repeat of what we've just said here. I mean, you need to have that risk knowledge, knowing how to create risk scenarios, as in this could happen, XYZ could happen. You need to have the knowledge to identify the risk, to evaluate, and then to propose mitigation. But we'll talk about all of that. Regulatory knowledge, as we've said, threat evaluation, knowing how to evaluate a threat. And when I say evaluate a threat, it's knowing how to assess a threat and to be able to make a risk-based judgment as to whether that is really a threat or not, whether that threat actor really poses a threat or not to your company. So again, with the example of the door the door example that I talked about this morning, the house in the gated community. So let's say that you've read that there have been bandits operating in another town in your country, and they've been breaking into houses that don't have a lock on their doors, but you live in a gated community in another town where there's never been a burglary, and you've got army barracks opposite you, and you've got a gated community, and you've got a broken lock, but you've never locked your door because no one else has ever locked their doors in that community. Is the fact that the other town has experienced this spate of burglaries, is that fact sufficient for you to log that as a threat to your home? Let me translate that into the business environment now. Would a baker business that doesn't process any information, that doesn't have any computers on site, would that bakery view a cyber criminal as a threat to their business as much as a bank that processes loads of personal information and loads of financial information? So the IT risk professional needs to be able to adopt a risk-based approach when evaluating threats, and to be able to present realistic threats to the business. If everything that you present to the business is rejected as a threat, where the business is saying to you, well, that's not really a threat because we don't process personal information, or that's not really a threat because we don't store any information on site, everything's in the cloud, then you need to reassess or relearn your threat evaluation skills, because we only need to present real threats to our business, not threats to other people's businesses, to our boards. The IT risk professional also needs to understand what controls are available. A control is something that you implement to reduce the impact or the probability of the risk materializing, but we'll talk about that later. The IT risk professional also needs to understand policies, standards, and frameworks in particular that apply to their industry and to their company. We also need to be able to prepare documentation. We need to be able to conduct vulnerability assessments and quantitative and qualitative risk assessments, which we'll do later. IT risk professionals' competencies: ongoing risk management, so identifying new threats, new technologies, making sure that whenever new technologies are introduced to our company, that we conduct a risk assessment. When the culture changes, for example, with a merger and acquisition, again, we adopt a risk assessment. We conduct a risk assessment. When new standards or regulations are released that apply to our company, again, we conduct a risk assessment. So risk management isn't a one-off exercise. It is a continuous iterative process. We need to understand how to conduct a cost-benefit analysis, because what we're seeking to do is to present to the business controls where the benefit of implementing that risk control will outweigh the costs. Brief example, if we're saying to the business that the value at risk, if this information asset were to be stolen or hacked into, is 50K. That's how much we could potentially be fined for it, 50K. We can't then go and present to the business a risk proposal, a risk mitigation plan that says, okay, that you should now go and buy a tool for $1 million to protect that information asset that is worth 50K. So we need to have the skill to be able to conduct a cost-benefit analysis and to present to the board all the costs. And we'll talk about this maybe next week. I think we'll most likely do that next week. We'll do a cost-benefit analysis next week, where we'll see how we can make sure that the solutions, the risk treatment that we're presenting to the board, the benefits outweigh the costs. The only time that we may be required to present a risk treatment to the board where the cost outweighs the benefits is if a regulator has mandated that we need to implement that solution. Stakeholder management and engagement. It's important. Remember, I said this morning that we need to be able to build relationships. So we need that skill, stakeholder management and engagement. Also, diplomacy and clarity. Integrity, we talked about earlier as well. Integrity and ethics. Don't compromise your integrity in whatever you do. Training and awareness. And then emotional intelligence. I've written this in, and I've written this in an abbreviated comment here. Don't take matters personally. If you present a risk proposal, a risk treatment proposal to the business, I think we should buy this because here is the risk, here is the cost, you've done all your work, here's the risk, here's the cost of treatment, here's the benefits to be derived, and the business says, no, we have decided to reject that risk treatment, we're going to accept the risk. Regardless of your personal opinion, do not take things personally. Do not take matters personally. Because, as I said this morning, it's not about you and me. It's about the business. It is solely about the business. So don't take matters personally. Daniel's asked me to give an example, please, of the technologies that I referred to. So any technology could be new. If the business decides that it's going to implement a new CRM system, customer relationship management system, there will be risks. If the business decides that it's going to implement a new email classification system or tool, whereby as soon as an employee clicks on send, you're required to classify the email as confidential, sensitive. You're required to just click on a button that says confidential, sensitive, or personal information. That's a new system. Any new technology that is implemented requires a risk assessment. Can anyone think of a risk that could occur if a new classification tool, email classification tool, were to be implemented? So we've decided that we're going to implement a new email classification tool whereby as soon as an employee clicks on send, they're then required to select what class of information they're sending out. Can anyone think of of a risk that could materialize from that new system? Any suggestions? Thank you. Okay. It's okay to not be sure. Downtime. Yes, downtime. What happens if you implement the system and no one can send any emails? So you need to plan for that risk. Also, yes, I was just going to say that. Improper classification. Yes, people could actually classify the information wrongly without training. Yeah, if it's not user-friendly, unless the system has been configured to not send emails unless it has been classified, people could not use the tool. Yes, the risk of an email being sent to the wrong group will always exist, regardless of whether a new tool is implemented or not. But that is a risk that remains with email, so you're correct. But if an email is, if the tool is implemented without testing, without thorough testing, and it stops all employees from sending emails, even if it stops all employees from sending emails for 5 minutes, that could occur at a critical time where a bank, for example, is required to send transaction reports to the regulator within a certain time frame, and the email classification tool blocks them. Or a company may be required to submit a tender at 5 p.m. on the day. And at 5 minutes to 5, the system blocks them. And that's the end of that bid. So whenever we're implementing new technologies, we always conduct a risk assessment. Yep, and so we've got lack of proper understanding in how to use the tool, risk of integrity and confidentiality. Those risks will again always remain whether a new tool is implemented or not. But these are all the things that we're required to do and the things that we're required to know how to do. Risk assessments when new threats emerge, threats of war, new technologies, culture changes, new standards or regulation, emotional intelligence, to not take things personally. That's so important. What is operational risk? So remember I said that a lot of roles that I see advertised nowadays actually mention operational risk rather than IT risk. Or if you're working in IT risk or technology risk, then you're required to work, you're recruited to work in the operational risk department. That is the risk of people, tech, cyber, health and safety, legal, regulatory risk, business risk. Operational risk is business risk. It's the risk of doing business. What are the different people risks? Internal or external fraud, theft, mismanagement, error. Remember we talked about disgruntled employees this morning, and someone asked why a disgruntled employee or how or why a disgruntled employee could pose a risk. Number one, they could steal corporate information, including just taking photographs on their laptops, by the way, which we can't do anything about. We can't do anything about people taking photographs, although there is this screen that I've heard that you can put on your system and then you can't take any photographs of but I'm not too sure. I haven't seen that in operation before. But theft of corporate data, sending emails to work emails to private email addresses if they're leaving the company. Internal fraud, from the top to the bottom level of the organization. Employees using their systems for business that could be used for blackmail against the organization, sending inappropriate content across the corporate systems, corporate email. And I always say to people that, you know, if you can avoid it, even if the company says that you can use the corporate network for limited business, for limited personal use, there's no need to do so. There's no need to do so. You can use your mobile phone in your lunch break to send, or in a break to send personal information. People mismanagement, error, these are part of operational risk. Legal regulatory risk, as we've said, market risk, reputational risk, credit risk, privacy breaches, contract breaches, employment law breaches. How can strikes and blockages affect information security risk or IT risk? How can these affect IT risk? How can pandemics affect IT risk? Accidents at work as well? Because we can all see how tech and cyber risk can affect our roles, but how can strikes, blockages affect our roles? How can pandemics affect our roles? Anyone want to write responses in the chat window? Any ideas? Okay, so we've just come out of a pandemic, or we're just emerging from a pandemic. So how, let's just see the chat. Strikes could affect delivering projects on time. Yes. Employees not available to assist. Do we think, or do we know rather, that some IT cyber professionals who may have been classed as critical staff may have died during the pandemic? We're not immune to sickness. So sometimes we may find that we need to record the non-availability of key IT staff in the office. So we need to be aware of those risks. Strikes could affect delivering projects on time. Employees may have limited access to the office. Yes, and we could have online meetings and working from home, which would be classed as a mitigation within the risk log. However, one of the issues is that you still need certain IT staff to go into the office for your data center, for hardware swaps, for example. You know, where they change, where they need to upgrade or update hard disk drives. That can't be done remotely from home. Yeah, so some are not accessible from home. Some work is simply not accessible from home. But that first comment, personnel not available to assist, we need to all note that down in our risk logs, that we may have a situation where key personnel, key staff are not available to assist in the event of a systems outage, cyber attack, a pandemic, natural disaster. So all of these could give rise to IT risk, strikes, blockages, where employees are unable to come into the office, or core employees who are required to change hardware at data centers or upgrade hardware, they're unable to come into the office. Then what? A global shortage of components, memory, CPUs, That could give rise to IT risk. Disputes with vendors could give rise to IT risk. With a critical vendor, where they refuse to then release patches for your application, for a critical application, until the dispute has been settled. A cyber attack, we can all see how these could give rise to IT risk, but all of these also give rise to IT risk. So we just need to bear this in mind. Now, here's what NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a very critical institute, US-based, here's what they have to say about information risk, information security risk controls. They must be risk-based and cost-effective. Controls must be justified. This is the risk that the company is facing, and I will not be presenting you with treatments for risks that another company is facing. I will not go out there and view the risks that a company like BP is facing, and then go and prepare a risk log for my bakery to present these risks to my line manager. If I work in a bakery, I should be presenting risks that are specific to my company, to my manager, not risks that are peculiar to the financial services sector. So those controls must be risk-based and they must be cost-effective. The benefits must outweigh the costs. If we conduct incorrect risk assessments, or if we go and try and copy another company's risk assessments, or we take a risk log from a company that we've worked with previously, and we try and apply the same risk log or present the same risk log to our new company, we will end up presenting them with controls that are incorrectly designed because they're not designed for that company. And if the company tends to take our word, if the company chooses to take our word without questioning us, based on our reputation or based on our expertise, they choose to take our word and they say, okay, yes, you can go along and implement those controls that have been incorrectly designed because they weren't designed for their company. Those controls will not be implemented correctly. They will not be implemented correctly because they were not designed to mitigate the risk for this company. So never copy a previous company. Well, you shouldn't be copying a previous company's risk log anyway, because that risk log is confidential. It is sensitive information. But never copy a company's strategy and then go and copy it and present that strategy to your new company as here's the IT risk strategy for this company, because they could be in different industries. They may be using different technologies, but they will definitely have a different corporate mission. Controls must be traceable back to the risks that they were designed to mitigate. And here's how you would be able to detect. So I would be able to detect if a risk manager has presented to me a risk log with risk for another company. I would simply ask the question, okay, what peculiar risk are you seeking to mitigate within my company, within this company that we both work in now? What particular risk? If they can't articulate, if they can't explain the risk that they're seeking to mitigate, then it's a no from me. It's a no, because the control must be justified. You must be providing me with a justification as to why you're asking me to give you revenue to mitigate that risk. Why you're asking me for money for a firewall when we've already got 2 firewalls and we don't process that much personal information on this site, in this business? So controls must be justified and they must be traceable. You must be able to say, I implemented these 2 firewalls because we were facing this particular risk, not because you heard that JP Morgan had just been attacked, or not because you heard that Barclays had just been attacked. Rather, I implemented these controls because these are the vulnerabilities that we have within our company. So controls must be traceable back to the risk that they are designed to mitigate. What is operational resilience? Gartner says it's a set of techniques that allow people, processes, and information systems to adapt to change. So again, IT risk management is not simply about IT. It's about business, operations, finance, information security, governance, risk, and compliance, all interconnected. The FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, says operational resilience is the ability of firms, financial market infrastructures, and the financial sector as a whole to prevent, adapt, and respond to, and to recover from and learn from operational disruption. So again, our IT risk log should be prepared to enhance operational resilience. We should be seeking, when we're identifying those risks, to prevent operational disruption and to lessen the impact and enable our companies to recover from any operational disruption. We should be seeking to enhance our company's overall operational resilience, not just IT resilience. Why do we need operational resilience? We need to ensure that all our stakeholders, that they're protected from the impact of internal and external adverse events and disruptions, any disruptions. So we could have external adverse events that have nothing to do with IT, as we just spoke, for example, about the pandemic. But what IT risk professionals need to be doing is to try and reduce the disruptions to our critical business operations by identifying risks before the actual disruptions occur. So some firms, before the pandemic, some firms had already started enabling their employees to work from home. They had the secure systems in place, secure access, secure remote access, secure authentication. All of that was in place. So when the pandemic occurred, they simply just told all their employees, work from home. But other organizations weren't so prepared. And so they just had to start responding to the pandemic at the time it occurred. Whereas with IT risk professionals, we go in and we recommend, we identify risks before the problems occur. Have you got the capability as an organization to enable your employees to work from home in the event of a strike, in the event of a blockage, in the event of a natural disaster? We ask questions like that, note it as a risk, make recommendations with regards to mitigating that risk. We could say that, okay, that if we invest in a remote authentication system, we invest in adequate security, we enable Outlook web access, for example, so that our staff can start using that from home. Even if we don't allow our employees to work from home today, it's still a good investment for when staff may be off sick. You put that in the risk log, discuss it. If the firm accepts it, then that's fine. If they don't accept that risk, then that's fine. They just sign off to say, no, that we're not accepting this, that we're not going to treat it, that we're simply going to log it and accept the risk as a risk that we're just going to need to live with. But at least you've raised it so that in the event the risk materializes, you're not going to say, I told you so, but at least the organization will know what to do. But it's better if the organization is actually guided by you before an adverse event, and they implement these controls so that they're prepared in advance for any adverse event. Infrastructure resilience. Well, of course, we can have hardware system faults. We can have change projects gone wrong, such as TSB years ago, user error, power failures, data corruption. That's also real. And that presents risks to every business's operations. Sometimes all we hear is news of a new cyber attack, yet another new cyber attack. And so we don't tend to retain our focus on the information assets and the other issues here about our infrastructure, about user error. But we still need to identify risks around these, because they are risks to our organization continuing in business. Cyber resilience, in most companies today, in most internet-enabled companies today, especially larger companies, the risk of a serious cyber attack is today one of the top 3 risks that they will face. And when we say a cyber attack, we're not just talking about hacking or viruses or things like that, just the risk of an insider or external cyber attack is one of the top 3 risks. Fraud, cyber attacks, market risk, but cyber resilience is our main concern as IT risk professionals or cyber risk professionals in this instance. Cyber risk professionals, we're focused on cyber resilience. Technology risk professionals, yes, we could focus on infrastructure resilience in addition to focusing on the information assets. A cyber resilience firm or cyber resilient firm is able to promptly, or should be able to operate, continue to operate and promptly recover from a cyber attack. Regulators understand that most firms will be attacked at least once. However, they also require us to be pre-prepared. How can a company be pre-prepared? By hiring skilled InfoSec professionals, providing training, ongoing training to all staff, planning for cyber crisis, third-party due diligence, and planning for adverse incidents, and then testing for recovery. So regulators expect us to pre-prepare for a cyber attack to enable us to promptly recover from such an attack. That is what a cyber resilient firm is, a firm that is pre-prepared and that is able to promptly recover after a cyber attack. Third-party resilience. We've got third-party vendors, including outsourced offshore providers, app dev consultancies, cloud solution providers. They are all threats to our operations. Why are they threats? Because we don't have any visibility over their controls that they have in place. If the third party is connected to us and we have no visibility on the controls that they have in place to secure their external network, that is a threat. Let us now take a brief break. Now let's take a look at fourth party resilience. This is something recent that regulators have started inquiring about, fourth party resilience. So fourth party vendors are those vendors who may have been subcontracted by our third parties to process our data. So I've given an example here. The ladder back down may outsource its volunteer recruitment process to a small one-person owned recruitment firm. So if the ladder back down were recruiting volunteers, we could outsource the recruitment process to a small firm, recruitment firm, Tambourine Recruitment. Why would we want to outsource that? Because recruitment isn't our core business at the ladder back down. Now, let's say Tambourine Recruitment is contracted to send out letters inviting volunteer candidates to interviews. So Tambourine is literally processing our candidates' personal data. They set up interviews with the owner of the ladder back down and they send out volunteer contracts once a volunteer is offered a role. Tambourine is a specialist recruitment company, but they may not have the facilities to store their data, including the ladder back down to recruitment data, on site. So they could subcontract the storage of all of their data, including the ladder back down's data, to a small cloud provider. The small cloud provider is now the ladder back down's fourth party, whilst Tambourine remains the third party. And the ladder back down is obliged to ask due diligence questions from their third party about the fourth party, the cloud provider. I need to ask questions on behalf of the ladder back down about how that small cloud provider is storing all my volunteer data. I can't simply say that I've transferred the accountability for my volunteers' data to Tambourine Recruitment. I've transferred the responsibility, which I can do, but I can't transfer the accountability. So if that fourth party cloud provider is now breached, the regulators and the volunteers would be asking me questions. They won't be asking the fourth party because they never had a contract with that fourth party. So I am obliged and required to ensure that I'm asking due diligence questions as an IT risk professional from third parties and fourth parties to our business. Key risk standards. We've got ISO IEC 31000. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. An effect is a deviation from the expected. So you're expecting something and there's a deviation. That is referred to as a risk, and it could be positive or negative. That deviation could be positive or negative, as we said, could result in opportunities or a negative outcome. ISO IEC 27005 says information security risk is the potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset or a group of assets and thereby cause harm to the organization. These are two key risk standards, especially ISO IEC 27005. Then we've got ISATO's COBIT 5, which defines IT risk as business risk associated with the use, ownership, operation, involvement, influence, and adoption of IT within an organization. So primarily it's saying that risk is a business risk. IT risk is a business risk, as we've said earlier. And it covers the use, ownership, operation, and adoption of IT within an organization. ISO 27001, for the delegate that mentioned that they're an ISMS, Information Security Management Manager also, ISO 27001 says it's a risk-based information security management system, seeking to ensure that implemented controls are based on the risk to your organization, not to another company's risk. So making sure that the implemented controls are tailored towards identified risks in your organization. NIST provides a standard, a risk standard that integrates security, privacy, and cyber supply chain, third-party supply chain risk management activities. So NIST is a US-based but globally recognized standard. They provide a standard that integrates security, privacy, and cyber supply chain risk management activities. That is something important that I haven't mentioned here today, that although we can view ourselves as IT or information or cyber risk professionals, we still need to be aware of privacy regulations, including the GDPR, UK Data Protection Act, HIPAA if we're in the US, and other global privacy regulations. Because remember, we're protecting information assets. Risk ownership. A senior responsible officer or owner must accept ownership for each risk. They're responsible, essentially, the risk owner is responsible for ensuring that the risk is acknowledged and managed properly. They determine the risk acceptance level. And one thing that I'll say is that whenever you create a risk log, or if you contribute to a risk log, you need to ensure that a risk owner signs to acknowledge the risk. So the company will have one risk owner for, or may have one risk owner who accepts all information security risks. But they may say that, a risk owner may exist for each business unit that owns all the information assets in that business unit or that department. But a senior responsible owner must accept ownership for each risk by signing in the risk log. They must accept that ownership of that risk. Yes, so we can have more than one risk owner on the risk log, dependent on the risk. If it's done by business units in that company, they could say, well, all finance systems risks should be owned by the CFO. So any risks identified, the CFO will sign, especially where the CFO has decided to accept the risk. No, the risk owner has to be a named person. So in response to that second question, the risk owner must be a named person. What is inherent risk? So someone mentioned this earlier, and that is a risk that exists regardless of the controls that have been put in place. A risk that exists as a result of the operations. So a petrol station, as I said earlier, will always have an inherent risk of a fire outbreak because of the nature of what a petrol station supplies. And areas with higher levels of inherent risk may require additional controls, may require extra controls compared to the rest of the business. For example, in banks, you have investment banks, or I'm not sure about retail banks, but in investment banks, for example, you have this thing referred to as risk control, referred to as Chinese walls, where traders are kept separate to researchers, and barriers are implemented so that the researchers are not providing information to traders that will enable them to take part in insider trading. So areas with higher levels of inherent risk may require additional controls to other departments. And an ICU, intensive care unit in a hospital, will require additional controls with regards to patient safety now than a department where they're not treating high dependency patients. So an example could be a power supply unit, additional power supply units placed in systems, or generator plants placed in an ICU, for example, because there must be power supplied to that ICU 24/7. Whereas in other areas of an hospital, they may say, well, we don't normally experience power shortages, so we're just going to live without a generator. So areas with higher levels of inherent risk may require additional controls. What is a secondary risk? That is a risk that occurs as the direct result of the implementation of a risk control. So you've implemented a firewall to block malicious attempts to access your information or to access your infrastructure. And then that has given rise to a risk, or you've noted that that could give rise to a risk of nobody being able to access your network. We talked earlier about the implementation of an email classification tool, and some mentioned secondary risks that could arise, including employees not being able to send emails out. So that is a secondary risk. A secondary risk is a risk that occurs as the direct result of the implementation of a risk control. So whenever we're writing out our risks in the risk log, we need to make sure that we're also looking out for secondary risks and logging those. Okay, there's a risk of information, emails being sent to the wrong email address or being sent out, sensitive information being sent out without any encryption or security controls. So I would recommend that we purchase an email classification tool where users have to click to classify that email before it is sent out. And if it's clicked as sensitive, then that means that it is encrypted when it goes out. So you write up that risk, you propose the email classification tool, but you also then need to document any secondary risks. That if we implement this, staff may not know how to classify their data correctly. And what control would you recommend if staff are unable to classify, if you raise a risk that staff may not know how to classify their data correctly? Let's write the answers down in the chat. So we've said that there's a main risk, primary risk, that users may be sending sensitive information to, to customers or externally or internally within the company. We've recommended that to mitigate that, we could, so 1 minute. So we've recommended that to mitigate that and to reduce the risk of that occurring, we're going to recommend that the company brings in an email classification tool. We're now also noting a secondary risk that if the company brings in an email classification tool, staff may not know how to use that tool. So what would we then recommend to the business to treat that secondary risk of staff not knowing how to use the tool? What would you recommend that they do? So that staff, yes, that's it, awareness training. So we would recommend as treatments that we need to conduct some awareness training so that staff are able to use the tool correctly, once we've implemented it. Yep, manuals, we could provide manuals. So that training could be done face-to-face, or we could provide brief bullet point manuals for our employees. What is residual risk? That is the level of risk that remains after the implementation of controls. So we could implement a control, we could do awareness training, we could do everything that we've proposed to do, and yet the risk still remains. The risk may still remain. But okay, that we've provided a manual, we've done face-to-face training, but there may be 5% of our employees that still don't know how to use the tool. In which case, the only option available to the business may be for the risk owner to accept the risk. And if the risk owner accepts the risk, then that just needs to be noted in the risk log, which we will get to. The risk owner needs to accept the risk that, okay, we've treated the risk by implementing a new email classification tool. We've also introduced training and awareness for our employees so that they know how to use the tool. However, at some point, we need to recognize that not everyone will use this tool or be able to use this tool, in which case that residual risk, that is the risk that remains following the implementation of the controls, must be accepted and signed as accepted in the risk log by the risk owner. What is a control risk? So a control risk is a risk that a control is not operating correctly, in which case it may not prevent a failure or a breach. So if we've got this control, we've got this new email classification tool, if it's not been configured to work correctly, or it's not operating correctly, then it won't be protecting the organization. It won't be stopping individuals from sending sensitive data without encryption. And how do we actually get to a place where our controls present risks to the organization? If the controls are ineffective, if they're the wrong type of control, if the business did not need an email classification tool, if they just needed an encryption tool, or if they needed an automatic tool that would just scan the email for keywords and then encrypt and then classify the email automatically, that may be the control that the organization actually needed. Whereas we've bought in a tool that recommended and then bought a tool that half of our employees cannot use. That's the wrong type of control. So these are threats, improper operation of the control, where it's been misconfigured. Another control risk is where we do not monitor the control. So we've implemented the control, IT say, yes, we've brought in this new tool, and it's not monitored to see if our employees are actually using the tool. These are all threats that result in control risk, the risk of our controls not actually working correctly and then failing to do what it was brought in to do, what it was implemented to do. Project risk. Projects fail, they tend to fail for different reasons, and most of us here would have heard of project risks. Companies tend to deliver their projects over budget or belatedly, or they deliver systems that fail to meet our customers' needs. Again, what has this got to do with the information security or IT risk manager or professional? Sometimes we will be hired to work on a project to implement a system. So again, as IT risk professionals, we don't just need to understand systems. We need to also understand project management. We don't just need to understand risk management. We need to understand it in the context of projects, programs. And most projects, including IT controls implementation projects, tend to fail for these reasons. And again, the impact is usually felt by the company. Loss of market share, failure to seize opportunities, impact on customers, shareholders, employee confidence, and prevents employees from doing their jobs. When we implement a tool that doesn't work, and then we now expect our employees to take time to try and learn that tool and to make it work. Yes, scope creep. Someone has said one of the major project failure causes is scope creep, where the business says that we're going to implement this tool. You start the project and then they say, oh, could you add this to it? And could you add that to it? And could you add that to it? But risk and ethics, we've talked about this, integrity, but what does this, what does this have to do with an IT or InfoSec professional? Again, we talked about disgruntled employees. Employees may be disgruntled for various reasons, including holding a perception that they've been treated unfairly or singled out, or they've not been treated fairly, and this may lead to fraud. And ethics, an individual's beliefs of right and wrong may not be the same as organizational ethics. And when I say personal beliefs, this isn't necessarily you and I, but you may actually be working with colleagues who don't have those ethics. And they could be a threat to the organization's objectives, and they could use IT to commit fraud against the organization or to harm the organization, releasing ransomware or something like that. So risk and ethics is important, not only for us as individuals, but also in terms of mitigating internal fraud and mitigating operational risk. Around times of mass layoffs, where a company is laying off loads of employees, making them redundant, that's a time when we need to watch out for disgruntled employees and raise that risk in our risk logs in terms of what they could do to the organization and to our IT landscape or cybersecurity landscape. Business continuity risk. So that refers to the prevention, mitigation, and recovery from disruptions in business operations. The IT risk professional, remember we keep saying, is responsible for supporting the business objectives, trying to ensure that the organization survives an adverse event. IT risk management works with crisis management, incident management, business continuity teams to address those possible adverse events proactively. And as we were told earlier, yes, involve IT users in drills, crisis management drills, incident response drills. Involve users, involve employees. IT risk management works with crisis management, incident management, business continuity to address possible adverse events proactively. And we make sure that we put into place plans to ensure detection, containment, and recovery. Recovery is the most important of those three issues that we've mentioned there. Detection, yes, we need the ability to detect when we've experienced an incident, an IT crisis or IT incident. We need to be able to contain, but we also need to be able to recover promptly. We need to be able to recover promptly, and that's what regulators are after. They want to see our crisis management plans, our incident response plans, our recovery plans, to make sure that our customers, our industry, our employees don't suffer as a result of a business interruption. With our business continuity, risk assessment supports a business impact assessment or business impact analysis and the creation of a business continuity plan. So when the organization is doing a high-level business continuity plan, they will require each department head to prepare a risk assessment and to outline what impact those risks would have on the business operations. So IT would prepare a risk assessment of all IT risks and the impact that these risks could have on the continued operations of the business. A finance risk manager would prepare a financial risk assessment report outlining financial risks and the potential impact on the business. And that would all go into the business impact assessment or business impact analysis report and help the business to create a business continuity plan. Again, business continuity planning is concerned with the preservation of critical business functions in the event of an adverse event. If an adverse event were to occur, business continuity planning is there to ensure that we promptly detect the event, we promptly contain the event to limit the spread of the event, and then we promptly recover from the event. A risk professional, IT risk professional, may be required to evaluate the effectiveness of the business continuity plan. So you could be asked to read the business continuity plan with regards to the IT risks and to make recommendations to the business on how to improve that business continuity plan. And business continuity planning is a whole industry, although more frequently nowadays, we're being asked for evidence of skills with regards to operational resilience, which includes business continuity. So change risk. I think I've seen the word change frequently today. Once a new system or business process becomes operational, new risks emerge, as I said earlier. And the changes may affect the risk profile or risk status, such as changes in technology. We've talked about a new technology being introduced. Also patches. Patches may be applied. Not sure if any of us has ever had a Windows update apply patches to our personal systems at home, and then something hasn't worked after that. It happens. Changes in configuration. Someone may inadvertently change something. An IT engineer could change something that results in the entire business being unable to connect to the network. I've had that before, many years ago, where on a Sunday evening, this engineer was working from home, I believe it was then, although I'm not sure whether we had enabled remote working then, but this engineer did something, and I just noticed on that Sunday evening, I just noticed that the time when I logged into my company network then, that the time wasn't the same as the time on my home computer. And I didn't think anything of it, but I went into work the next day and was immediately told that nearly 3,000 staff couldn't log in across 250 locations. And we spent 26 hours on the phone to Microsoft, being transferred from one country to the other, following the sun. Each time one country closed, they would tell us, well, sorry, we're closing now, we'll transfer you to Asia. Sorry, we're closing now, we'll transfer you to the US. And it took 26 hours for them to actually resolve the error. So that is a change risk. Changes in the operational environment could also result in a change risk. IT risk and information security or IT information systems audit. Audit provides assurance to management that the controls in place are effective and that they are adequate, and that these controls to reduce or to treat the risk are actually commensurate, that we haven't included controls that are over the top for the risk, that we've implemented risk-based controls. An audit is really dependent on the objectivity, not only on the objectivity, but also on the skill of the auditor. If you've got an auditor who is very risk adverse, who doesn't like taking any risk, they may fail a company on many points, saying you haven't got sufficient controls in place. But if you have got a risk-based auditor who understands risk, that risk is meant to be, controls are meant to be risk-based, they're meant to be commensurate, they're meant to be adequate for the business, rather than over the top, then the audit report should provide assurance rather than raise flags to management about the effectiveness of the controls in place. Levels, they're actually affected by the intent and the capability of a threat source. So a threat actor, like a cyber criminal, will only persist in trying to hack into your network or cause an organization harm if the information asset is valuable, for example, if they've got the skills to actually hack into your network, if there's a vulnerability, if there's no weakness in your controls, if you've got all your firewalls, if you've got all your patches up to date, all your ports are closed, then your risk levels will be fine. Your assets will be fine. Risk levels are also affected by the reliance on a supply chain or a third party, because again, as we said earlier, we can't go and demand that our third parties actually implement a certain control. So our risk levels will always be affected by the third party or the supply chain. If you go and outsource all your data or place all your data in the cloud with Amazon Web Service, AWS, or with Azure, you can't tell them what security controls to apply to their infrastructure, can you? You can't dictate that to them. So there will always be a level of risk, even if you've outsourced your data to one of the best or the top 3 cloud providers. There will always be some risk because you're relying on that third party to implement adequate controls. Now let's take a look at risk identification, domain 1. Here is the IT risk management lifecycle according to ISACA for the CRISC exam now. I have spoken throughout the duration of today's workshop on topics that are covered in the exam, but I've tried to make sure that I've spoken about real life experiences so that this isn't a workshop for those that want to sit the exam per se. If you want to sit the exam, yes, you will go and get the manual, or you may want to go and do training, but I wouldn't, I don't do training. I just read the manual, read white papers and things like that. But if you want to get the manual and read more about this certification, you can do so. However, what we've tried to do is to make sure that if you are a risk professional or an aspiring risk professional, you know what you need to do on the job. So let's talk about risk identification, which is the first domain of the CRISC certification. Now, what do we do when we identify risks? We identify the relevant threats. We identify our vulnerabilities that exist within our corporate environment. Then we document the risks. Here is the knowledge statement from ISACA. The CRISC professional requires a baseline level of knowledge and competence to enable them to adopt a professional approach to risk management. We've talked about that, about some baseline knowledge that is required, including the ability to collect and review information, including existing documentation about the organization's internal and external business and IT environments, so that we can identify potential or realize impacts of IT risks to the organization's what? Business objectives. It's about the business objectives and the business's operations. Identify potential threats and vulnerabilities to the organization's people, processes, and technology, so that we can conduct thorough IT risk analysis. Develop a comprehensive set of IT risk scenarios to determine the potential impact to business objectives and operations in the event that those scenarios were to materialize. So what do we need to do when we're seeking to identify risk? We identify key stakeholders. We establish an IT risk register. We identify the risk appetite and tolerance defined by senior leadership again and key stakeholders. We can't simply go and set risk appetite and tolerance ourselves. And again, if you're thinking that this is a lot of information, please rest assured that most companies that you go to work in will already have processes and risks in place. Your responsibility will simply be to go in, attend meetings, identify risks, listen and identify risks, and then discuss with your team. Unless you're aspiring to just go in and be the chief risk officer, you have nothing to fear with regards to being able to go into a company. We can all be risk managers because we all have experience of managing risk in our personal lives. We all have that experience in our personal lives, as I said first thing this morning, of identifying and managing risk, even though we don't know it. So we identify the risk appetite and tolerance, which is defined by, and it will be documented somewhere, by SMT. And then we collaborate in the development of risk awareness sessions and conduct training. I think that's the one thing that we may not be used to doing. But in some firms, it may be you as the risk officer, or IT risk officer, or IT risk professional that's required to develop a risk awareness program and then deliver the training. In some firms, they may have a training team that is there to do just that. What is the objective of the IT risk identification domain? That is to contribute to the execution of the IT risk management strategy in support of business objectives and in alignment with the enterprise risk management strategy. So the IT risk strategy cannot be drafted or held in isolation of the overall enterprise risk management strategy. The enterprise risk management strategy will have been created and will be managed at portfolio level in the company. When you go into the company, you won't then be required to draft a risk log from scratch. Each department will have been provided with a template, that will mirror the enterprise risk management strategy template. And what tends to happen in most companies is that some of your IT risks that have been rated as critical risks or high risks, and when we talk through a risk assessment, we'll see which examples of those. Some of your risks that have been rated as critical or high risk, once you've drafted them and you've agreed the risk scoring in your teams and with key stakeholders, those critical and high risks will then be moved into the enterprise risk log, so that portfolio and senior management, portfolio management and senior management can have a view of those risks. Whereas if the risks are rated as low or medium, or within the tolerance of the head of IT, CIO, or CISO, or whoever to deal with, then those risks can remain in the IT risk log. Do we remember what we said tolerance is and why it's there? It's so that the board and senior management portfolio don't need to deal with all risks. They don't need to deal with everything. They're allowed to get on with their work, with the delivery of their work, whilst entrusting IT risk managers and IT risk professionals to actually get on with their work. Only escalating risks that are outside of the tolerance that they have set to them. If they've said that they only want to see risks that are critical, then we only escalate critical risks to the enterprise risk management log. When we say acceptable risk, so acceptable risk needs to be escalated to the SMT, because it's the SMT, it's a senior management team that will reach a decision as to whether the risk is acceptable or not. So a risk needs to be accepted. If the risk is accepted, it needs to be accepted by a senior business, a senior manager, senior business manager. So let's give an example of a critical risk. So let's say the company is at risk of an information privacy breach affecting 10 users' private data or 10 customers' private data. The IT risk manager may say, actually, I'm not prepared to accept that risk because it's not within tolerance. So I'm going to escalate that risk to senior management, to enterprise. Why would they need to escalate it? It's so that senior management may say, actually, that we're prepared to accept that risk because the cost of bringing in encryption and classification just to protect the data of 10 key clients outweighs the benefits. If they're going to reach such a decision, then they need to sign off on that decision, that we have accepted the risk, that the costs, because the cost of implementing encryption and classification outweighs the benefits. Whereas if that risk were around, around the data leakage of 50,000 employees, then the board may take a different view that actually that we're not going to accept that risk. We're going to treat the risk. So any risks that are critical risks where the potential impact or the likelihood are enhanced and the risk scoring is therefore high, needs to be escalated to the board for them to either accept it or to say, no, we want you to implement these controls that you've proposed here. I hope that answered your question, Helen, there. So how to identify risk, and I've written here, not for lone rangers. So please don't worry about your ability or inability to identify risk. You won't be required to do this alone. You won't be required to take a pen and a pad and start walking around looking for risks. No, you can attend group workshops, from meetings, discussions, brainstorming, checklists, questionnaires, individual interviews where you're talking to the head of IT, talking to the head of information security, talking to engineers, talking to architects. And as they talk, you listen, you identify risks from what they're saying. Brainstorming where you have a group of experts together or other professionals from different teams. Checklists where you tick off what we've done. Have we got a firewall? Yes, we have. So that's not a risk. Have we got all ports closed on all our critical systems? Yes, we have. Have we hardened all our critical systems? Hardening is where you remove all unnecessary applications. And that's something that we don't do even on our personal phones or personal devices. Just to wake us up, can anyone write in the chat window, please, or everyone, if you can participate in the chat window, write what percentage of applications you use on your phone. So you've all got a number of applications on your phone. What percentage of applications do you use? So we've got 50%, 5%. Any other takers? You should just write in the chat window what percentage of applications you use on your phone. Yeah, so we've got everyone saying it, 20%, 25%, 35, 20, probably less than 20, 25%. Do you all know that each application on your phone, whether used or not used, is a risk to your phone? Each of those applications presents an opportunity for a hacker to gain access to your phone. So what is recommended usually is that you harden your phone or your laptop, your desktop. In companies, they're required to harden servers, IT is required to harden servers, systems, everything. You harden them. You remove anything that you're not using. And so for an IT risk expert, they would have a checklist, including seeing what applications are on the systems, corporate systems, and what's in use and what is not in use. And if it's not in use, the question will be asked, well, why is it on the system? Because it presents a further opportunity for a cyber criminal to access your phone or your system. Just received this question. Thanks, Victoria. How do you verify which app is safe to use? Well, one of the things we need to do to ensure that applications we download are safe to use is to make sure that we download apps through our app store on our mobile devices. We only buy or download applications from our app store. If we're buying software, then we also need to make sure that we buy software that is wrapped, shrink wrapped in paper, and it's got a trusted signature at the back of it. However, what I said earlier about the percentage of apps we use is that it's not about making sure that all apps that you use, that all apps that you use are secure. Well, it is about that. But in addition, it's about making sure that you remove, or as you've just said here, Victoria, disable applications that you don't use. Once you've removed that app from your system, that is one less risk on your mobile phone or on your laptop. It's one less risk. It is simply one less risk, one less opportunity for a hacker to gain access to your phone. So we're not saying don't use applications. We're not saying don't use WhatsApp. We're not saying don't use Telegram, don't use this, but make sure that you configure the security settings in all of these apps. And if you don't need that app, if you don't use it on your mobile device or on your systems, remove it. Remove it because you don't need it. Same as in the workplace. So checklists, make sure that systems are hardened. You go and take a tick box. What, you know, as an auditor, take a tick box, go and look at the systems in use, or even on your personal device as a user or IT risk professional. Okay, I've been given this company laptop and I've got about 50 apps on it that I don't use. Maybe I should suggest to information security that that's a risk because I don't use these applications. Because each application, whether used or not, they actually pose a risk to our system. So checklists, these are ways which we can identify risk. So don't worry about being required to just go and think of risk out of thin air, because you're not going to be required to do that. You will have others with you that you can bounce ideas of or ask questions, individual interviews, risk descriptions. You can take a look at risk descriptions in your risk log, risk categories. So they could have, okay, server risks, desktop risks, and other risks. Take a look at those and then just, you know, I mean, think of risks that could apply. And I can assure you that if you sit down and think, it's quite easy to think of risk. It is easy to think of risk when we sit down to do it, but many people just don't like thinking of risk. They'll simply say, oh, that's too risky. But saying that something is too risky, so I'm not going to think of it, doesn't remove the risk, doesn't remove the underlying risk. It doesn't treat the underlying risk. I'm not going to worry about it because it's too risky, it's too much to think about. As I said earlier, we need to understand, before we can identify risks, our regulatory, legal, and contractual documents now. We need to be able to read documents. If you work within the Financial Conduct Authority, as an IT risk professional, go and read up on any documents on the FCA's website or the PRA's website about operational risk. And even if you're not based in the UK, if you're in the US, then it's the SEC. But if you're based in Nigeria, for example, where I originate from, there's no harm in reading these documents to try and introduce good practice or best practice into your organization. So we understand regulatory, legal, contractual documents, all the laws that apply to our sector and to our organization with regards to IT and information security and information privacy. We read and understand our specific companies, policies, and relevant standards. And then we seek to understand the different business processes. What does HR do? How do they pay employees? What does finance do? How do they pay customers? How do they send invoices out? Are there any IT risks there? If we don't understand the business processes, if we don't understand the different roles in our company, the personnel, the different roles, the different technologies, we can't analyze, we can't even identify the risk. Let me talk briefly, although we may still get there today or maybe next week, but regarding cleaners and facility staff, why do we think that I mentioned or suggested that they should also be trained with regards to information security? What role do they have to play? Security guards, cleaners? Responses in the chat window. I'll give us a moment to type. They may end up as the weakest link. How? If untrained or unaware. Good point, but how? Let's just take that a bit further. Risk mitigation, yes, how? They could help with the system when users leave them on. Yes, so that's a very good point. And we're getting closer to the response. Yep, a cleaner may find a key to a system. Yes. Okay, so both those last two answers are getting very close. Our cleaners may find a key to a system or may find something dropped on the floor. Dropped on the floor after we've gone home. They may find a critical document on the floor after we've gone home. They may find a USB stick on the floor. Absolutely. And Jermaine has said, no, not Jermaine, Omolola has said something very, very valuable that I always say, that when we have gone home at night, when we are all sleeping in our beds at night, the cleaner is there cleaning those offices. The security guard is also there with unrestricted access to the office. They have unrestricted access when nobody else is there. They could go into our bins, as Ayokomi has said, dumpster diving. They could take USB sticks. They could also be for our good if we train them. They could be the foot police. So we're quite right here. It's important that we actually make sure that our security team are included in any awareness, any training, so that they don't even throw away critical documents or critical information. A note, a post-it note. Someone may write a critical number on a post-it note and stick it under their keyboard, which is wrong anyway. But the cleaner goes in, finds this, just tosses it into a bin or something. Or you drop a critical report. You put it at the behind your laptop or behind your monitor, and it drops under the desk. The cleaner picks it up when they're vacuuming, or they vacuum it up. So awareness. And our cleaners and security guards may also be vulnerable to fraud or bribery, where someone bribes them and says, okay, you know what? Here's 10 grand. Could you stick this USB stick behind XYZ's laptop or XYZ's desktop computer. Because none of us actually check our desktop PCs in the morning when we go into the office, do we? If we use a desktop rather than a laptop, we don't necessarily check the back of that desktop to see if someone's put a USB stick there. And if your company has not enabled or blocked USB sticks in Active Directory, if they haven't blocked USB sticks, anyone could put, a cleaner could happily put, a USB stick at the back of your laptop for 10 grand, and you wouldn't know a thing. So these are the sort of risks that we're actually required to identify and report to our businesses. And we also recommend training for our security guards and our cleaners, especially if our company has outsourced cleaning and security to another company. We need to make sure that in the contracts that there is a requirement on that third-party company to train their security guards that they send to our company, as well as their cleaning staff. We make sure that that is in the contractual clause before we bring on a new company, which would require us noting it as a risk and having the business delegate that risk to the contracts and procurement department to make sure that in every single contract that is, whenever they want to take on board a cleaning company or a security company, that they make sure that they sign and agree that they will send their cleaners or their security guards on annual refresher security training, IT risk training. So we identify relevant threats and vulnerabilities. So I've mentioned a threat there and a vulnerability. The threat of a cleaner or security guard sticking a USB stick at the back of our desktop PCs. The vulnerability there would be what? Let's ask what the vulnerability there would be, because I've mentioned the vulnerability. If the organization has not done what? Could we, okay, oh wow, we've got a lot of them. Yes, allowing USB or enabling USB ports or unblocked USB ports. If the company has not blocked USB port access, that is a vulnerability. That is a weakness in the organization's controls. So one of the things we would do as an IT risk professional is to note down in the risk log that we have got a vulnerability in that everyone is still able to access their USB port. And the threat could come from an internal user who's using their USB port and USB key to take data out of the company. The threat could also come from an outsider, such as a security guard or a cleaner. So there's a threat and a vulnerability right there that we could log. So risk identification tasks, we identify relevant threats and vulnerabilities. We maintain the risk log with other threats, with new threats and vulnerabilities identified. We evaluate the risks, including the probability and impact of these on the business processes and operations. So for that risk that I've just mentioned there, what would be the potential risk to the business of someone sticking a USB key in a USB port that hasn't been blocked and exfiltrating data from that port? What might the risk be? What might the risk be to the organization? What could it cost the organization? What might it cost the organization? I'm looking for one answer, which is a very blurry answer. Loss of confidential assets, yes, that's one. But it depends. Yep, loss of personal information or PI data breaches, yes, but it depends. It depends on whose system they've logged their USB key in. Yes, the company could be fined, exactly. They could be fined. Very valid answer there. Company could be fined. Reputational damage. Reputational damage. They could lose intellectual property, which is a key one. Yes, they could be subjected to illegal monitoring of their company activities. Could experience fines, reputational damage, regulatory fines, legal challenges from users whose data has been breached. So very many potential impacts on an organization if a personal data breach is experienced. And it's our responsibility to identify these threats and vulnerabilities, and to log those threats and vulnerabilities, assess the risk to the organization based on these threats and vulnerabilities, and then to recommend controls. Now, if we look there, and we may recall that I said repeatedly in the morning that if there's no threat, but there are vulnerabilities, then that means that there's no risk. And if there are threats, but there are no vulnerabilities, then there's no risk. So if we think of this risk that I've just mentioned here about someone, a cleaner putting a USB stick in a port. If the organization has blocked all 100% of its USB ports, is there a risk? A cleaner could put a USB stick in that port, but is there a risk if all ports are blocked? Yet there's no risk. Absolutely, there's no risk. So that's what I meant when I was mentioning that this morning, that if there is no vulnerability, then there's no risk. Or if there's a vulnerability, but there's no threats, no threat actors, then again, there's no risk. Questions in the chat window? Questions? Okay. So let's take a look at this risk identification methods. How can we identify risk? We can identify risk through historical events. What has happened previously? We can discuss risk scenarios. What if this were to happen? So I've just given us a risk scenario there. We all go home late at night. A cleaner is given £10,000, which may be a whole year's salary for that cleaner. So they are persuaded, could be someone with integrity who's never been tested before. They need money and they've been offered £10,000. So they come in to do their job, wait until everyone's gone, and then they put the USB stick there. That's a scenario. So that's how we identify risks, either through going through what's happened, well, not either through, this is a combination of things that we can use to identify risks. Historical events, inventing risk scenarios, engaging expert opinion. Industry experts may have a view on the sort of risks that we face within our organization. Then business process examination, where you sit with a business unit head, such as payroll, and say, show me how you do your job. Show me how you do your job from receiving timesheets to paying each employee in their bank account. Walk me through this. When examining that business process of payroll, you may find that, okay, that you identify risks. And you can also identify risks when a system has changed or a new system has been implemented, like the email system that we talked about earlier. And looking in the chat window, when I asked the questions, Victoria asked, what are some key factors you look for when hiring new employees? Well, that could include background checks. Background checks, knowledge, and willingness to learn. Willingness to learn and willingness to share knowledge as well. I'm not in a role where I'm responsible for hiring new employees, but I have been in the past in many roles where I've hired new employees, and I've always hired those that are willing to learn, those who acknowledge that they don't know everything, just like I don't know everything. And I often ask this question, or I used to ask this question when interviewing staff, which some people have said is unfair. But I get a good gauge of employees from this. I ask the question, would you lie for me? Okay, so I'll go through this in a moment. I'll respond to your question, Omalola, in a moment. But I ask the question, would you lie for me? And if an employee says yes, then I often think, well, if you will lie to me, for me, then that means that you could lie to me. It's not tricky. I mean, so I understand what you said there, Jermaine, in terms of that's a tricky question, but somebody that could lie for you is not demonstrating that they're there to support the business. I don't want to hire someone that is coming in there to protect me. I'm requiring someone to come in there and protect the business. Everything that I do will always be in the best interest of the business. The business, that is the number one thing for me, the best interest of the business. And if you say that you would lie for me, then that suggests that you could lie to me or you could lie against me as well. So integrity is so important. And I know that in most of these IT exams, they also have a question on ethics. And it's so interesting because, you know, I mean, everyone will answer correctly, I believe, in these exams, But it's not about answering correctly. It's about the practical implementation. Yes, that word integrity. I'm not scared to say that word integrity. And if anyone views my CV, I've got integrity written all over it. That I'm an integrity-based, integrity-focused individual. And that I'll only work henceforth in companies that value my integrity, that don't view my integrity as an impediment. It's so important. And I'm just responding to Victoria's question. What are some of the key factors that you look for when hiring new employees? Integrity of character. You can train any employee, any human, in how to do stuff. As I said, you'd most likely walk into a company as a new employee and they will have their risk log, they'll have their risk documents, their risk reports, they'll have a template. You can look at previous risks and get a view of how to write risks from an existing template or from previous logs. You can easily do that. But you can't train someone in integrity. You can't train a grown person in integrity. So that's the key factor that I look in terms of when seeking to hire a new employee, or when I've done so in the past. And Omolola asked the question, are there psychometric tests that could identify if a new employee could be a threat? Yeah, I'm sure that there are psychometric tests that could identify that, but but I haven't done a psychometric test like that. Landmark Worldwide is a great place to train integrity. Well, I live in Hope, but I'm not sure as to whether one can train integrity rather than a person deciding to develop. Yes, again, I'm not too sure as to whether one could develop integrity in another person, unless you're saying this is a place where the person will go and learn to develop their own integrity. But I think integrity, okay, so it's for a party to decide, I'm going to go and develop integrity because I want to develop integrity. Although again, I'm not too sure whether that's a case of whether you need to train or develop your integrity, or whether you need to reach a decision. I think integrity is a decision rather than a training need. A choice. I think living with integrity is a choice rather than something that requires one to undergo training or development needs. But now let's move on. So risk register and log inputs. Where do we get the inputs to our risk register and risk log? Well, we can attend risk workshops and we discuss risks, we brainstorm, and we get risks and we input them into our risk log. Pen tests, penetration tests, and vulnerability assessments, which we will talk about shortly. We can obtain risks from our penetration tests or auditors' reports. Vulnerability assessments, we identify risks, we put them in our risk register. Incidents, once we've experienced an incident, an IT or InfoSec incident, we input risks into our risk log. Mainstream media, we could have reports of different threats or different incidents. We read up on incidents that have occurred within other companies. If we have similar vulnerabilities, or if we read, for example, that all banks in London are potentially being targeted, and that 50 have been successfully targeted so far, then we need to note that as a risk if we work in a bank, in the risk log. SOC 2 assessments, those are for large companies that may be required to undergo SOC 2 assessments, in particular cloud providers, large, massive manufacturing companies, and other companies, we could identify risks from those. Those are similar actually to auditors' reports. Annual reports and financial statements. Again, a lot of people just shake their head when I say this, or they hate me when I say this, but it's always a good idea to go onto your company's registration authority's website. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Charity Commission for charities, where they register themselves as an entity, or Companies House for businesses that are not charities. Each year, they're required to file an annual report, financial statement. In that report, there is generally some information about projects that they've undertaken or that they may be looking to undertake in the short term, in the next year. You may identify some risks from these annual statements. I recently viewed a company's annual statements, and it was talking about, risks that meant that the company may not actually be a going concern in a year's time, which means that they may not be in operation. They may not have enough finances to continue for the next year. And that was information that I needed to know. So we can always identify risks from our company's annual reports or financial statements. Disaster recovery or business continuity plans, risks, put them in the risk log. Public forums, public discussion forums. Your internal CERT, that is your computer emergency response team, or CIRT, computer incident response team, and your SOC teams. They will also, or could also, provide risks that could be inputted into your risk log. Other documents that you may be required to use to identify risks and risk stakeholders here now include your RACI document. RACI, that is a stakeholder map or stakeholder register of those that are responsible for managing or remediating a risk, those accountable, which will usually be an SMT member, that are answerable for the risk, those that need to be consulted for the risk. They provide feedback and advice to the responsible stakeholder and the accountable stakeholder, and those that need to be kept informed. So your RACI document will have a list of these individuals in there. Those that need to be kept informed. Who might need to be kept informed with regards to the progress of an information systems risk? Regarding the process of risk mitigation. Let's say you have a finance system and you've documented a risk, you've recommended controls, and those controls have been accepted. So you've been given money to implement the controls. You've been given funds to implement the controls. Who might need to be kept informed regarding the progress of the risk mitigation? Okay, let's see. Senior management, yeah, the CFO and senior management, absolutely. Yes, CFO, because they're the systems owner. It's the finance system, and senior management. And there may be other stakeholders within the finance team. So now let's take a look at a sample risk register. It's got the date, and here's some different risks here. Unencrypted emails sent to the wrong recipient. What is the risk category? That is a technical risk. Could also be a regulatory risk. The date the risk was added is 2nd of May 2021. What is the likelihood score? We've rated this as a 4. And then the impact score is 5. It would have a high impact on the business. Why? Because we could get fined for that. Now, the overall risk is calculated as the likelihood times the impact. This is a qualitative risk assessment, by the way, because we haven't included any quantitative costs or calculations besides the likelihood times impact. What controls have we identified? Data leakage prevention tools, such as the data classification tool that I mentioned earlier. Training and awareness. That is another control that I'm recommending that the business should implement. We could also block emails to personal addresses so that if they're going to send the email to the wrong recipient, at least if we block emails to all Gmail accounts, to all Hotmail accounts, to all AOL accounts, etc., then at least we reduce the risk of this unencrypted email being sent to personal email addresses. Now, the business has decided we're just going to select this control, DLP tools and training and awareness. They're not looking to block emails to personal addresses because maybe the IT manager said, well, actually that won't reduce this risk of the unencrypted email being sent to the wrong recipient, because we could still send it to the wrong client or the wrong or a wrong customer at a corporate address. So this would just block emails to staff's email addresses, but not to the wrong recipient. They can still send it to the wrong recipient in another company. So they've decided to select the tools, DLP tools, data leakage prevention tools, and training and awareness. And who is the risk owner? The IT manager and the training manager. They will own that risk going forward. They will also be responsible for making sure that these two tools are delivered. Well, these two controls are delivered. Inability to respond to subject requests. Now that is a risk, that is a privacy risk. Regulatory risk, it's regulatory because if we're unable to respond to data subject access requests where a customer or even employee sends in a request for us to send them their personal data, if we're unable to respond, we could be fined by the regulators, we could be penalized. So we have again the date added, likelihood score. It's unlikely that we'll be unable to respond. Why is it unlikely? Maybe because we have controls in place already. We've just completed our GDPR implementation and we've tested it. So we know that we are able to respond. So the likelihood we have put as 2, but the impact would be 5. And so the overall risk is 2 times 5, which is 10, medium. So we can say that we should create a subject access request policy. We can train our heads of departments to respond. We could train the governance team. And so we've now said, okay, that we've selected all of these 3 controls. failure to comply with the DPIA, data protection impact assessment requirement. Regulatory, we've said again, this is unlikely because we have got our data protection impact assessment policies. We've got everything that we need. We've got the impact, again, would be high though, 5, and the overall risk is 5 low. So we've said that these are the controls that we've identified and that we're going to implement. The risk owner is the data protection officer. And let's now look through this. A customer sues us for a personal data protection breach. We could say that's a reputational risk and a legal risk. We've added the dates, the likelihood score 3, impact score 5, overall risk 15 high. So we're saying training and awareness, training manager. Let me ask a question now. Which of these risks, if the senior management team has set a tolerance of high risks to be escalated to them, only high risks, which of these risks would we actually escalate to the board stroke senior management? If we could just put that in our chat window. That's it. Yes, 1 and 4. We would just escalate 1 and 4 because those are above tolerance. And then in our team, as IT risk professionals, we would then just be left with these 2 risks. The 2 risks, 1 and 4, would actually be escalated into the enterprise risk management log or register. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. So that's what we would do. So we would escalate these to the senior management, and that would then be included in the enterprise risk management log, because these would have the biggest impact on the organization. Any reputational or legal risk would have, high risk, would have a major impact on the business's objectives. And if anyone thinks, well, how would I know if this is a high likelihood? Again, that's based on the vulnerabilities that exist within the organization. The impact tends to be clear. I mean, if it's a regulatory impact, then it's high. Reputational, legal, especially a legal impact, that would be high. So the impact score in all of these, the potential impact is high for all of these, whereas the likelihood varies. And even though the impact of these 2 are high, because we know that we have got some controls in place, the likelihood is then reduced. Whereas the likelihood on this first risk is high, rated as a 4, because we don't have data leakage prevention tools in place. So what we're doing is that sorry, I'm just trying to, okay. When we're doing our analysis and assessment, risk assessment, we're identifying the way things are currently. And then we're now looking to identify where we would like to be. So we identify where we currently are, what our current risk landscape is, what our current IT risk landscape is. And then we identify where we think we would like to be. And then we now conduct a gap analysis. So we need to understand what classes of data do we process, including personal data, sensitive data, public data, intellectual property. All of those data need to be put into different classes. We also need to understand, and again, most of this would have been done before we arrive on the scene, so don't worry, I mean, if you don't know what to do, most of it will be done if you're joining a mature organization. Then you need to understand, identify and understand your data lifecycle management strategies. How long is your different class of data stored for? If you work within a hospital or a healthcare setting, there may be a law requiring your organization to store patients' data for a patient's lifetime, definitely, and then maybe 50 years after they've died. So you need to understand that. If you work in the financial services sector, it may be that you're required to store customer data for 7 years, for the entire duration of the relationship, and then for 7 years or so after the relationship with that customer has ended. You need to understand storage, retention, archiving, how sensitive or personal data is anonymized within your company. When it's stored, is it encrypted before it's stored? Is it encrypted? Do we encrypt sensitive information before we email this, if we've got a data leakage prevention tool? We need to understand if third parties or fourth parties are processing our data. We need to understand, if we're in the UK or in the EU, whether any of our data is stored inside and out or outside the EU. That's so important, especially if you store your data with cloud providers, including the big cloud providers. You need to ensure that you understand whether these big cloud providers are storing your data or backing up your data or replicating your data for business continuity purposes outside the EU. Don't say because they're a big processor, because they're a big data processor, that they can just do that. It needs to be included in the contract, their obligation to store your data and back up your data within the EU, including the data of all EU citizens that may be your customers, EU residents rather, is vital. That should be included in your company's contracts. If it's not included in your company's IT contracts, you need to question why it's not included. And it may be that the cloud provider has a corporate binding agreement where they are allowed to store that data, but it needs to be in your contracts, basically in your IT contracts, IT procurement contracts. So you need to review what actually exists now in that company, if that's in your job description, because it won't be in everyone's job description. But as an IT risk professional, it's great to have an understanding of all these things. And I've mentioned the GDPR with regards to firms in the UK, but please let me just emphasize that the GDPR regulation applies to any company anywhere in the world that is processing the data of an EU resident. So if you have customers, if you're a bank in Africa or in the US, and you have customers from the EU that live in the EU, then you are required to comply with the GDPR regulations as pertains to that EU resident. It doesn't matter if that EU resident is from your country or originates from your country, you're still required to comply with the GDPR with regards to the processing of their data. So we identify the state of where we are now, and then we now design our future state. So when we're talking about you've identified a GDPR risk, for example. You've identified a privacy risk, an information privacy risk as an IT risk professional. So you design your future state, where you want to be, where you want your organization to be in the future. And then you could be required to design process improvements. What do we need to do to get to our desired state? Forecast the timeline. So as an IT risk officer, I think I need to just emphasize this, that you may have responsibility for privacy as well. For data privacy, you may have that responsibility. So it's important that we understand that if it's in your job profile, then you may have responsibility for data privacy. Then you obtain board commitment with regards to implementing the controls that you have said are missing in your current state. If you haven't got encryption software, if you're not using encrypted software to encrypt your data, your emails before you send them out, you're not using data classification software to encrypt your data leakage prevention software to encrypt your emails before you send it out, you need to make sure that you note that down in your risk log. If data is being stored outside the EU with your cloud providers, you need to make sure you notify that in the risk log. If your third-party contracts that have been previously signed, including by a predecessor, haven't got information security and information privacy clauses within those contracts, you need to raise that as a risk, flag it as a risk, and recommend controls. Recommend that if the cloud provider stores your data outside the EU, maybe you need to renegotiate the contract with them and say that you would like all your data to be stored within the EU. That will cost money to correct a clause that has been previously signed, or you could recommend that alternatively, you move to another cloud provider, which will cost even more money. Whatever we do, if the board says that they're going to accept the risk of senior management, then someone needs to sign. And although I've said that sometimes the responsibility lies with information security to protect personal data, including sensitive data of our customers and employees, actually, we should still highlight the need for a data protection officer in one of our recommended controls and highlight the sense of urgency of implementing those controls in our risk log. So we've identified our current processes. We've identified our current risks that we're processing as an organization, personal and sensitive data. We're storing that data beyond what the regulations allow us to. We're using third-party cloud providers who are storing the data outside the EU. We've identified all of these as risk. We include those in our risk log, and then we obtain a signature from the board with regards to whether they're going to accept the risk. We have risk owners who accept responsibility for implementing all these technical controls in particular. And we also make recommendations that, okay, that we have grown to a size where we may need a data protection officer. And we also highlight the sense of urgency. So this is a sample gap analysis. We've identified the as is, identified the where we would like to get to be, prepared a blueprint, and then we've obtained a signature from the board. And although I haven't said this today, I don't think, without the board backing or SMT backing support, we can't do anything. No matter how enthusiastic we are or may be about IT risk management, we can't do anything if the board doesn't buy in to what we want to do. IT risk management, we're on the last leg now, 45 minutes, and then we're done. The CIA triad. We are hired to protect the confidentiality, integrity of our data, and to ensure the availability of our information assets. So we're there to protect the confidentiality and integrity of our information assets and to ensure the availability of our information assets. That is the CIA triad. IT risk management also regards authentication. We're there to look for risks with regards to our authentication of users, the authorization of our users, and the accounting of our user activity on our infrastructure. Authentication. What is authentication? What is an authentication document that most of us have or may have? Yes, verifying the person, that's correct. Authentication is to verify. What is an authentication document that most of us may have? A passport, thank you. Thank you. I was just trying to make sure that we're all awake. So a passport is an authentication document that most of us have. What sort of privileges are granted after the authentication process? When we're authorized, what sort of privileges may be granted to us on our infrastructure? What's that? CRUD? CRUD, you mentioned CRUD there, Daniel. Access, yeah, access, once we're authenticated, we're granted, thank you, yes. So yes, so we can We can be granted the privilege to create information, to read information, to update information, or to delete information. Thank you. Then we've got access control. We're granted privileges dependent on our role. That's a very good one as well. We're always authorized on a need-to-know basis. And as an IT risk manager, you'll be identifying risks around the way the company, your company, grants privileges to users. Do they use role-based access control, as Helen has just mentioned there, or do they simply grant everybody access as requested? A line manager may say, okay, I want all my users to just have access to everything. Is there any questioning from IT regarding what everything actually means? Do they need access to this information to carry out their role? Or are you just requesting access to everything because you don't have the time to sit down and work out what everybody needs? So an IT risk manager could note that everyone in the finance department has access to a single folder when only finance managers need access to that folder. That is an authorization risk. They've been granted more privileges than they actually need. Accounting is where an audit trail is created of user activity. And an IT risk professional may be taking a look and saying, we haven't actually enabled login. That is login with a G at the end, to enable us to actually audit access on our infrastructure. That is a risk. Granting too many privileges is an authorization risk. Not implementing role-based access control is a risk. Not auditing access is also a risk. So here are some vulnerabilities, weaknesses, gaps, missing or ineffective controls, including network, application and hardware vulnerabilities, buildings, unsecured buildings, inexperienced or unaware employees who haven't been trained in risk, or who are unaware that it's even their responsibility to reduce risk, IT risk within the company. We could identify a weakness or vulnerability based on the organizational culture. We could identify vulnerabilities around inefficient processes, or a resistance to change. If the culture involves a resistance to change because IT or InfoSec doesn't have a good relationship with the business, that is a vulnerability, that is a weakness. That is a weakness that could be exploited by a threat actor. Vulnerability assessment stroke penetration test or pen test. That is where a company, a certified ethical hacker perhaps, could try to break in, by simulating the approach of an attacker to test the effectiveness of our controls and response procedures. Why? Because they're seeking to help us to identify risks. They're seeking out potential points of failure by trying to break in to our infrastructure so that they can present us with risks for us to remediate, for us to fix. Many large companies would conduct an annual pen test, but some companies will conduct more frequent pen tests just to identify critical and high risks and fix those urgently before those vulnerabilities are exploited by threat actors. So there's a summary of domain 1. The risk professional must have the skills to identify risk, and that requires an understanding of business goals, as we've mentioned, management priorities and operational risks. And then it requires us to create the risk register and contribute to the enterprise risk register by escalating critical risks and high risks that are above S&T's set tolerance to enterprise risk management to deal with. The second domain is IT risk assessment. So we've talked about IT risk identification, how we can identify potential risks, but we haven't talked about IT risk assessment. How do we then assess these risks? Again, we've talked about the identification of threats, vulnerabilities, assets and controls, and the documentation of identified risk in the risk log. When we now talk about risk assessment, what we're doing is we're seeking to evaluate the potential effects of a risk if the risk were to materialize, the potential impact. We're also seeking to evaluate the probability or the likelihood of the risk materializing. How likely is it that this risk will actually materialize? Sometimes we can also estimate or evaluate the proximity of the risk. How soon might this risk materialize? Now, let me ask a question, and I'll just give us a brief scenario. We've built our data, or we've purchased a data center, a building, to place all our critical systems in the building, data center, private data center. It's obscure from most access, so most people don't even know it's a data center, but we've gone out and purchased that. And then we haven't done our due diligence. We haven't done any pre-purchase due diligence to see what that area is like, whether it gets burgled all the time or whether the weather is okay, whether the weather's conducive. You know, I mean, we haven't done any due diligence at all. And then we hear that every winter that area, including that building, gets flooded. What is the proximity of that risk materializing, of our servers actually getting swept away or wet or damaged due to the risk of a flood? What is the proximity of that risk materializing? How soon might that risk materialize? Let's just take a look here. That is the likelihood that is very high. The likelihood would be very high, and also the probability, but what is the proximity? So I'll just briefly explain. Yes, the season we're in. So if we're in March now, or we're in the summer, and you know our winter is December, then the proximity or the closeness is 6 months. Because in the summer, we've deduced that in the summer every year, that building and that area gets flooded. So if we're in July now and we're identifying that risk, the proximity of that risk is 6 months' time. And so we've got 6 months to figure out exactly what we're going to do to reduce the impact. We can't actually reduce the probability of that risk materializing if every single year that area and that building is flooded. We can't reduce the probability of the same thing happening this year. But what we could seek to do is to reduce the impact, the potential impact, once the risk materializes. How might we reduce the impact of that building flooding, the impact of our servers getting wet? How could we reduce the impact of all of our servers getting wet and damaged? Any options? Okay, that's fine. That's okay. Relocate, build higher server racks, disaster recovery, reinforce the foundation and raise the floor above the flood level, move our servers to another location. Yes, so these are all very good answers and very good responses. Yes, we could relocate, because I have actually heard someone say that they actually bought which is why I raised this scenario. They purchased the data center location, signed a contract and everything. They had to take a list, and then they discovered something about that location. I don't know whether it was weather or it was vandals or something, but whatever the case, they had to just move out straight away, and they lost a lot of money on that contract. But they chose to do that rather than to continue, with the risk that they knew was definitely going to realize. They could build higher server racks. Again, that could still be flooded, but the relocate one, I definitely like. Disaster recovery, yes, where you implement another disaster recovery location in another location so that the data is replicated across the two sites. And then when this data center gets flooded, you just have to take the hit. Reinforce the foundation and raise the floor above the flood level. Yes, again, that could be very costly. So an organization would expect the IT risk professional proposing that as an option to present costings. Remember, we've said that whatever risk treatment is adopted, it has to be supported by a cost/benefits analysis or best cost benefits assessment, where we're saying, here is the cost to reinforce the foundation and raise the floor above the flood level. Here is the cost, but here will be the benefits. We may never be flooded again. And here is the cost. So when we're presenting options in terms of risk treatment, we wouldn't simply say, okay, relocate. We would say, here's the cost of relocation versus here's the cost of reinforcing the foundation. And here's the cost of, and so actually Daniel said that it will all depend on our budget, a cost benefits assessment. But we would present, it's our responsibility to present the business with options. These are the sort of things that I propose that we could do to treat this risk. We've moved into the building. We could either take the loss on the contract, and that again will depend on how much the loss would be. Or we could simply do some work on this building. And then we now need to think what will be the secondary risk. What would be the residual risk, rather? So we've reinforced the floor and the foundation. What is the residual risk? Because there will still be some risk. Could still happen that we reinforce the foundation and then water comes flooding the building from the top and sends the ceiling crashing down on our servers. So all of those just need to be documented and assessed, those risks, and then we present options to the business with regards to controls that could reduce the likelihood or the impact of that risk from materializing. So we've said this already. Why do we actually assess risks? The idea is to enable senior management to reach informed decisions about those IT risks. We also assess our risks to evaluate the effectiveness of existing controls that we've put into place, or that have been put into place by IT or InfoSec. We also do our risk assessments to assess the gaps between the current and the desired state of the IT risk environment, as we spoke about earlier. Where are we currently and where would we like to be? We conduct our risk assessment to communicate the results to relevant stakeholders that can do something about the risk. And we also seek to do our risk assessment to provide assurance to relevant stakeholders, the board, for example, that are accountable for our risks, to provide assurance to them that we are managing risks effectively in our businesses. Yes, and I like what Daniel has said there, that this is some serious scenario planning, but one question that always has to be at the back of a risk professional's mind is, can someone complete that sentence for me in the chat window? What is one question that needs to be at the back of, it's one question, it's actually a question, 2 words, but it's a question. Can anyone guess what question needs to be at the back of it's a question. Question, 2 words, and the words don't have risk. That is it. Thank you, Victoria. What if? What if? Those 2 words. What if? Even if you're not a risk professional, when you're going out, when you wake up, what if this were to happen? What would I do? Remember, we started today by talking about interview preparedness. What if it were to rain? What if the trains aren't running tomorrow? What if this? What if I do this? What if I do that? What if I get stuck on a train? So what if is an important question that we need to continue to ask ourselves, which is why, you know, I said that in response to Daniel's point that this is some serious scenario planning, that yes, that you can say, okay, I propose that we raise the foundation on this building to above floor level. But then you need to follow that up with another question. What if rain comes in from the ceiling? So what if will always get us to a good place when it comes to, when it comes to scenario planning and, risk planning. What if? Simple 2 words, but really, really useful when you're thinking of risk. Here are the different risk treatments. As we've said, eliminate, avoid, or terminate. They mean the same thing. And I know I've said that it's impossible to eliminate risk. We've agreed on that, unless we stop doing the activity that has given rise to the risk. So, for example, if we don't want any information security risk, that means we need to be prepared to not process information. And I don't know how many businesses can survive without processing information. So if you want to avoid or eliminate the risk of a fire at a fire station, at a petrol station, the only thing you can do is to close the petrol station. That way you can totally eliminate risk, the risk of a fire. That is the only way. But if you want to reduce that risk or mitigate that risk, that's when you can do things such as implementing your training and awareness to your petrol station agents that are in the offices that sell and that take payments. Train them, make sure that they're prepared for a fire. You have many fire extinguishers. You also have warning signs on the petrol pumps. You have sand buckets. All of those are designed to reduce the risk of a fire, not to eliminate the risk of a fire. To reduce the probability of the risk materializing of a fire, you've got the warning signs. To reduce the impact, you've got the buckets of sand and the fire extinguishers. So these are different risk treatments. We can also transfer the risk. We transfer the risk in 2 ways, either by outsourcing the information processing or the business process to a company where that is their core business. We can outsource, or we can insure the risk. Now, let's ask another question. When we transfer the risk, when we outsource the risk, what are we seeking to reduce out of the probability or the impact of a risk? When we transfer, when we outsource. When we outsource the risk, what are we seeking to reduce? The probability or the impact of a risk materializing. Besides costs, so that is a risk treatment. So we're seeking to reduce. When we outsource, what we're seeking to reduce is the probability of the risk materializing. Because when we outsource, let's say, for example, you're outsourcing your recruitment. You're outsourcing your recruitment process to a company that is a specialist in that area. When you outsource your email scanning, inbound email scanning or outbound, both ways, to an external company, you're outsourcing that to a specialist company where that is their business, that is their bread and butter. So they're more specialists at doing it than us. Sorry, excuse me. Yes, we transfer ownership, but not accountability. We can transfer ownership, but not accountability. So we're reducing the probability of the risk occurring. When we insure, that was my next question. What are we reducing there? What are we seeking to reduce? The probability or the impact? Absolutely. We're looking to reduce the financial impact to our company. When we insure, we're not affecting the probability at all. When we insure against a risk, it doesn't mean that the risk is less likely to occur, to materialize. It just means that when the risk materializes, if the risk materializes, then we will get financial compensation for it. When a driver insures their car, all they're doing is they're reducing the financial impacts if anything were to happen to that car. But they're not reducing the risk of the car being stolen, for example. But when they put a steering lock on the car or wheel lock, what they're seeking to do is to reduce the probability or the likelihood of the car being stolen. So we can transfer the risk by outsourcing or by insuring against that risk. But when we transfer that risk in response again to Daniel's question, we cannot transfer the accountability. That accountability for that business process still lies with the board. So if we outsource our HR function and there's a breach with the third party, the employees will seek redress from the employer, from our company, whereas the company may seek redress from the third party that they've outsourced to. But your customers and your employees won't want to hear anything to do with the third party. Indeed, the third party has no contractual relationship with the employees whose data that they're processing. They have a contractual relationship with your company. So we can't transfer accountability. We can transfer responsibility, but not accountability. And the final risk treatment, as we've repeated today, is to accept the risk, where the board has all the information that we've presented to them, or senior management, they have all the information we've presented to them, and they simply say, you know what, we are going to accept this risk. We're going to accept this residual risk or accept this risk as it stands with no treatment, because the costs outweigh the benefits, any further benefits. In some cases, you may propose some risk treatments and they accept those risk treatments, and they're actually, in all cases, there will still be that residual risk left, because the only way that we can eliminate risk totally is to stop the activity. So the board will then accept that residual risk and sign to say, yes, we have done everything to treat this risk, but we now accept this. Why do we think that we keep seeing banks being fined, 50 million, 10 million, this million, every time, every year for money laundering, for example? It's not because they're not putting enough effort into anti-money laundering practices. It's simply because they cannot totally eliminate that risk without folding or without going out of business. They can offer training to employees, training on a daily basis. They offer training, annual training, compliance training. They hire compliance managers, executives to deal with the issue, but they can't totally eliminate the risk of money laundering because people are people. And for that reason, they simply put a budget aside for fines and they accept the residual risk. They just accept the residual risk, knowing that the risk will materialize, but they've done everything that they can to reduce the probability and the impact by training their employees. We've talked about the cost benefits analysis as one of the risk acceptance considerations. So our boards will consider the cost/benefit analysis. We've also got regulations, and I think I mentioned that this morning, that sometimes the regulator will say, no, that you have to implement controls, else we could deregister you, in which case the company has then got to implement those controls regardless of the cost. We may also need to take into account the availability of controls. If we're saying that we need 1,000 new firewalls for this 50,000 strong employer, we need to implement 1,000 new firewalls, and there's a global shortage of components, IT components for our firewalls, then the board may need to accept that risk until that global shortage is resolved with global manufacturers. Now that happens a lot actually, where sometimes, manufacturers in China may, just say, well, okay, we've got a shortage of metal or things like that. And that affects the supply chain, that affects technical components available for systems. If the controls aren't available, then the board has to accept the risk. This last one, risk versus reward considerations, again, it's similar to the cost benefit analysis. If we don't accept this risk and we treat this, what is the reward? What is in it for us as a company? Risk versus reward. And I'll say something now, and let me stop the recording on that note, and I'll redo the recording before next week anyway. So I'll stop the recording.